Hi and welcome. Phil Aston here from Now Spinning Magazine, and I'm delighted to be introducing a brand new podcast. And joining me as my guest is Chris Wright, who's a fantastic member of the Facebook community, where he is our in-house expert on all things to do with improving the sound of your music collection, whether that's just tweaking things, the equipment, or hi-fi. And Chris is going to talk about everything to do with that. Some of you may recognize Chris's hands and voice from the fantastic Bebop Deluxe, Deluxe Edition videos we did recently. And I also hope that there's 2 new videos soon to be on their way. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, it is. I'm sorry about that. We've moved recently from Utah to Minnesota, and it's been chaos. So if anyone has been waiting for those, they are on their way.
Now, we had an inquiry this morning for somebody, I think it was in Japan, saying when was the Red Noise one on its way.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I better get really going good. Then. Yeah.
But Chris, today we're going to be focusing on your expertise on how to get the best from your music collection. And it was important to you that we talked about that aspect rather than use the word hi-fi.
I don't like I don't like the word. It describes, it has so many connotations, doesn't it? Because people think, well, do I have a hi-fi system or don't I? You know, some people have exotic systems, some people have the most basic systems. But my way of thinking with this is that it's all about the music. And I think Alan Parsons made the comment that he thinks hi-fi enthusiasts play records just to hear how good their system is. I don't agree with that completely. I think there is an element of it, because obviously if something sounds great, then you'd possibly play it more on a good system.
I mean, we're both from the generation, aren't we, where a lot of us, well, especially when I was at school, people bought Dark Side of the Moon because of how it would make your music system sound.
Oh, yeah. And of course, we went through a whole phase of this with sound. I mean, you know, obviously what we're all about in the group and Now Spinning as a brand really is talking about physical formats. Yeah. And what we've seen in the last few years is, you know, this return to the physical format. And whereas we very unfortunately had the pandemic, what that actually did is, as you can imagine, everybody was stuck at home. So orders for hi-fi equipment just went through the roof. And I think also streaming has, you know, led to more physical media purchases. So as people have been rebuilding or building a physical media collection, you know, there's been this greater emphasis on, well, how can I make it sound better? The good news is you don't have to spend a fortune, which is why I don't like the word hi-fi too much, because then people think, oh, it's an exotic system. And yes, of course, I have something like that, but that's just because I've developed it over years.
Yeah, of course.
It's not the level everybody wants to go to. I think what most people want to know is, you know, what can I do to make it sound better? And really that all really evolves around looking at, I believe, you know, if you look at a collection and how much a collection costs, how much you spend, you can't really put a fraction of how much you'd spend of your collection on a sound system. But I think it's important to remember that, you know, if you've got a very, very, very inexpensive turntable, let's say, that is not going to get the best results for you. But that doesn't mean to say you've got to go and spend thousands. For very little investment, you can buy a decent second-hand turntable, let's say, and there's a lot of those out there. You know, something like a second-hand Rager or even an old Technics direct drive. People knock those in the hi-fi realm, but I say they're very, very good. I actually have an old one myself, which I use all the time for certain types of music. They sound great. So I think it's really a matter of that. It's also a matter of, you know, how you look after your stuff, making sure records are cleaned, that whole thing. But I think, yes, I think hi-fi is actually, if you call it that, let's say good sound quality has really come back to the fore in recent years. We went through all those terrible years of MP3 where everything sounded dreadful. And, you know, now you have the lossless streaming services. I happen to subscribe to Qobuz because I think it sounds the best. I've been with that for years and years, and it sounds great. And I think that's, you know, an entree really into, you know, hearing good sound as well. And even I'm wearing a pair of headphones. These are just a computer pair of headphones, but headphones is a big, big hobby, especially amongst the young. In fact, if you want to call it a gateway drug, headphones is actually quite very much that for the young generation now, because kids get into that and then they start to think about a 2-channel system, something more exotic, and it just grows. And the great thing about the hobby is that it can grow as much as you want it to.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be an all-consuming thing. It can be something that you just add to gradually. I mean, in your own case, Phil, you've been doing that too recently, haven't you?
I have, and we have the kind of demographic of the people that watch the channel, listen to the podcast, and probably more so than the Facebook group is we've got obviously people of our vintage, but there are a lot of younger people now coming in and discovering these bands. And what you mentioned about the turntable, if someone's kind of starting out or they're looking afresh at what they use to play their music collection, what is you mentioned the turntable, but what's the heart? What if you're going to spend your money? Is the turntable more important than the amp or the speaker or the speakers? Which comes first to get the? So, for instance, you've got some CDs. You've also you stream stuff. So you're thinking, what would I need to get to make my music system sound better tomorrow? Is that the amp or the speakers, or maybe the component that is the turntable? Or
of course, the easy answer is all three. But and it really depends the level that you're at. I mean, it's very difficult. There's sort of different schools of opinion on this. The Lin systems, when Lin HiFi systems became quite prominent in the sort of 70s and 80s. Ivor Tiefenbrunn, that started Lin, he very much extolled the virtue of the source, i.e. the record player or the CD player, the source being the important bit, and then you cascaded from there. You will get a lot of other people who will tell you that the speakers are the thing that are the most important, and you build back from there. What both are missing, and this has been my recent focus, is amplification. Amplification is way more important than people give it any credit for in some, well, not everybody, but some people don't give it enough credit. I've recently gone to a pretty exotic amplifier system, but it is nonetheless, what it does is it's new technology that uses THX. That's not THX in the way of surround sound. That's THX as a 2-channel system that completely eliminates distortion. I mean, to an absolutely vanishing degree. I mean, the products are by a company called Benchmark, and I've got the pre and power amp that they have, and enthusiasts will know immediately what ones they are. But basically, what they do is they can basically, to all intents and purposes, eliminate distortion, but also greatly increase the bandwidth of what you're hearing. And it's really interesting that they gave a talk a few Rocky Mountain Audio Fests ago, probably around 2013, when they launched the power amp, to say that most CD systems you don't really hear the full potential of them. And that's what I've been hearing lately. So there's a big argument for the amplifier. The amplifier, has to be the right power to drive the speakers. If you've got very low sensitivity speakers, you might need a very high power amp. Equally, if you've got very high sensitivity speakers, you can get away with a very light sort of tube amp. So there's any number of combinations here. So that's where the complication arises. But to answer your question directly, I would sort of be inclined to try and get a budget that allows you to, rather than make one big leap, is to make a leap across the 3 areas, so source, amplifier, and speakers. Because it's impossible to recommend anything unless you've got a specific budget. But I would say, for the purposes of what we're talking about here, I would go for a fairly even upgrade of everything, so that you're basically upping the quality of everything. And then once you've got to that point, then you're in a better place to say, right, well, where should I go from here? And here's the other bit of good news, which is also what was till recently, I think, the bad news. Of course, you'll know that, and in my time in England, I mean, I now live in the States, but I mean, basically, my time in England, every town had a hi-fi shop pretty well, didn't it? I mean, they were everywhere. So in those days, you had the ability to go in and get a demo of whatever it was you were wanting to listen to, and you'd have some objectivity. Some really good stores, the ones I used to deal with in Ipswich, where I come from, would, because they knew me, I guess they would lend me gear to listen to. which was great because I then got to hear the upgrade or the potential upgrade in the context of the system I already had. Yeah. Here's the good news, though. Mail order has developed to a point now where most of the good mail order houses will actually offer a 30 or 60-day return policy, and they're quite good about that because I think they've realised they've had to be, where at least you then get the chance to, you have to pay for it, but you can get a refund if you return it under the terms of those policies, where you can actually try that piece of kit for a fairly extended period of time in your own system to make sure it's, you've made the right move, really. So in a way, it's never been easier, even though we don't have the special. I mean, it's a shame that we don't have the specialists in every town, guiding you. But at least now you've got a lot of online material. I mean, YouTube is just full to the brim of equipment reviews, so that gives you some level of research. But then once you're starting to think to starting to shortlist what it is you actually want to upgrade next, then there is that possibility of buying it on a money back type basis, to make sure it works.
That's a very good point, because obviously I've just done that when I was looking for my CD transport. And the other thing the other thing for people to realise it and to understand, so you don't feel as if you've got to make this decision that's going to affect the rest of your life, is that this is a journey, a bit like buying your albums and your CD box sets, that whatever you buy, you will probably at some point move on to something else. And the other thing, of course, when your ears start to hear something on a different system, you suddenly, it's like you hear things for the first time again. Oh yeah. But then when you go up to another stage, you'll be amazed what the difference that will make. I think one of the things for CD fans, or especially younger fans of the CD, will think, well, the CD player is just a CD player. It just reads a digital signal and it's the same. I remember, my first CD player was about £100, which was the most I could afford at the time. It was a Philips, and they invented the CD, and it sounded fantastic. There was no sound between the tracks, nothing, just silence. Fantastic. But of course, they're not all made equal. And of course, CD technology has also moved forwards in the way that it has.
It has. Of course, CD players were becoming less and less available a few years ago. Yes, they are. That's true. But now they're making them again because, we've talked a lot, and I know that you've had a chat with Charlie this week about, the revival of CD, which is just fabulous to see and is very much ongoing. So we've had this thing now where suddenly CD is the thing again, and manufacturers are getting interested in making new equipment. The interesting thing that has always been the case with CD, if I go back, I came into CD, well, I suppose I first started listening to CD properly, probably 83, 84, very early into very early adopted. Very early into its birth. And it didn't sound very good. I mean, we were all enamored with the fact that there were no pops and clicks, and we were, the whole format was fascinating, and the fact that we could get 74 minutes of music on a CD, not having to change. There were so many compelling usage arguments for it that, I think in some ways we just kind of took to it. Like ducks to water. But if we were being objective looking back, they didn't sound very good. And the reason for that is that at a domestic level, at least, digital to analog conversion was at a very, very primitive stage compared with what we have now. And so the story of CD has been partly about making a good transport, having that transport built correctly, and there have been lots of developments in that. Through to the amplification stage in the CD player, having a sort of how you present to the amplifier, I should say, rather than having its own amplification stage. But also things like digital analog conversion has moved along massively. Yes, hugely. And that is something that you can actually, is another part of this, that if you have a CD player with a digital output, then you also have the possibility of upgrading to a digital analog converter, just a separate box that actually will, take the digital pulses and turn them into music, essentially. So that is something that, is the way to go in some ways. Having said that, CD players, even if they aren't with the latest DAC technology, really good CD players can sound utterly fantastic because they're all a contained unit. They're very much built to a certain voicing. And you can find that even a self-contained CD player can really hold its own, even if it's of some vintage. I've got a NAD M5 that I use at the moment. I think that was built around 2007, so it's not the very latest thing, but it still keeps up with my pretty new DAC, and because it's just a very well thought out, complete approach.
I agree totally with that. I've got a Rotel CD player. It's still in my garage that I've used as a backup, and that's always been very, very good. I had Audio Lab 2000, which was superb until it started to play up a bit. But my latest approach, which is the Roscan CD transport with a separate DAC, has taken the sound to a totally different level. But I think it's just for everyone listening thinking, do I need to have this or this? Not necessarily. I think it's you're going to move up. It's like if you're going to buy a car, you're going to slowly move to another one. And hi-fi is or making your music collection sound better, which is, as you just said, Chris, is hi-fi can just sound like sound waves and computer output on what the sound looks like, when people analyze things rather than what it sounds like. And it is a personal thing, isn't it? But something you've taught me about, which I kind of just pushed to one side thinking, I just want to put a record on. I get it out of the sleeve and I put it on, and then I played it and I put it away. And then sometime in the future I'll do the same. You introduced me to washing or cleaning your records,
yes.
which I thought was superfluous to requirements and like a Chinese tea ceremony and just making a cup of tea. But you were right. It's a revelation.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
I mean, talk a bit about record cleaning.
Well, it's been an interesting discussion point in the Facebook group for a while, hasn't it? And we, because members have kind of got into this a bit.
Yeah, they have.
Well, very simply, records acquire dirt. I mean, they just do. It's just how records are. And you have to address, again, it's all a matter of, all those records you see behind me, and that's not all of my stuff, but all of those ones, every record I have, before it gets presented onto my stylus, it has a vacuum clean. I use a very simple cleaner called a Record Doctor, which is a manual vacuum cleaner. You just basically apply liquid to the platter. You then just reverse that, stick it on the vacuum cleaner, and it just sucks the liquid out and then basically cleans it that way. You can go to absolutely astronomical levels of expense. There are ultrasonic systems now that work in the same way an ultrasonic cleaner does with jewelry, and really that was the kind of impetus for it. I'm still as yet not completely convinced about that. I do worry about the destruction of vinyl walls. I probably incorrectly, but I've just never felt that it's that necessary. I think what it basically boils down to is if you're buying terribly damaged vinyl, you can't make that sound good anyway. It might sound a bit better once you've cleaned it, but if you're basically creating a standard for yourself of, say, buying as best you can near mint only, then that is going, or better. Then that, if even a brand new record, I clean anyway, because they have certain chemicals on them and things, and they can be quite static. So there's that whole approach of cleaning them, and it just works really, really well. And the results are that the vinyl's a lot quieter. You're not clogging up the stylus ever, and if you put that in a anti-stat bag, and we've talked about using anti-stat guns. Really depends where you live. I seem to lead them less here than when I did in the very warm desert for some reason. So I'm not using my stat gun all the time right now, but an anti-stat gun's an important thing. But once you've cleaned that record, with a machine, then really you don't need to do it. I mean, people say you need to clean them all the time. That's just not true. As long as they've had a good, thorough vacuum clean every few years, I would say,
right,
that is more than enough. And funnily enough, they sound better and better. Sometimes you can't help but get a little bit of residual water, and it just dries in the grooves, I believe. And maybe the first time you play it might have a bit of extra noise there. It doesn't always happen, but it can do. And the better you get at cleaning it, the less that happens. But what actually that does is that when you've got the record playing, you basically, after say 3 or 4 plays, it sounds better than it ever did. You can't even believe how good it sounds. It sounds so quiet, and it's really fantastic to listen to. And again, that's a relatively cheap upgrade. I mean, you can buy these spin clean devices that some of the members have bought. I think for less. That's what you have, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's less than about £70 or something like that.
Well, what's that? The cost of a box set.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you think, and that's, I think, how you need to think about this. So, or not you personally, but how maybe people that haven't thought about hi-fi systems or music systems in the past, maybe they need to think about that balance of, do you need to buy another box set, or would it be better to clean your records?
Well, I think it's especially true with secondhand records, which a lot of people buy, and either from Discogs or eBay. And I think giving those a clean makes a massive difference to how they sound. And then, as you said, that protects your stylus, because it's not ploughing through those kind of dirty grooves, and then you're putting on a newer album where the stylus is going to be with the gunk stuck on the end of it. It's going to go through that. So I think it's just, as you say, it's looking after your. I'm not going to say investment, because it sounds like something you don't play and you don't use, but for you to enjoy it as it is, the pleasure of playing your music collection, you want to get the best out of it. Now, if we switch to CDs, obviously totally different animal, but do you have any tips for how you look after your discs?
Yeah, very simple, really. Again, I don't like liquid cleaners particularly. We've all heard the stories of CD rot. I seem to have been very lucky with that, and I think it is just luck. I don't have any examples in the thousands I've got. But at the end of the day, I think, a simple... I should have brought it with me. I have one of these, the sort of blower you used to blow dust off a camera lens. Yeah. I just use that with my CDs and just basically blow air onto them, which gets things like dust and dirt off them. Yeah. Sometimes they're not particularly prone to static, I find, and I find that just keeps them clean. You can use, I mean, obviously something's really damaged, but the key thing is to keep your fingers off them and just and the same with records. Just don't get finger marks on the playing surface, and that will, by and large, keep them. As long as you're keeping them in a reasonably dust-free environment, you'll be absolutely fine. CDs are actually really easy to look after, I think. People, there was this unfortunate sort of perfect sound forever kind of ethos that kind of came around with, Philips, making that. I think it's Philips that made that product statement when they first introduced it, and people thought, oh, good, I can sort of put marmalade on them and use them as a tea coaster, and then go and get the very best of hi-fi later in the day. Well, that can work to some extent, but obviously what you're doing is, any surface damage to a CD means that it's a lot harder for the laser to read that CD. So what's going to happen is that then you get into what's called error correction, which once a digital analog converter, or once a CD transport gets into error correction, then you're not hearing the purest of sound. You want to keep those errors to an absolute minimum. Right. And in fact, if you ever rip a CD, and people commonly now rip a CD as a backup to a hard drive, and I think with CD rot that's perfectly fine. I do it with all of mine too. And basically with that, a lot of the RIP readers that you can get will actually allow you to see if there's any errors on the disc, any reading errors.
Oh, that's good.
And you'd be surprised how many there are. But usually a good CD ripper will actually error correct for that as well.
Okay. Another thing I'd like to ask you is, because one of the things when people set up their either their new system, or they've moved house like you and they start to set everything up, they're connecting all the cables and they're getting ready to sit down to listen to an album or a CD, is there's all of a sudden an unexpected hum.
Oh dear. Oh no.
Yeah.
Well, that can be very difficult to trace. I mean, I get them. It's basically a process of elimination. You have to try everything. It could be something like a poor connection. It could be just how you've got. Sometimes people, because you get this kind of soup of wires. And
they're all
sometimes wires crisscrossing in a certain way. There's a million and one. There's no catch-all for that one, and it's really a process of elimination. Quite honestly, just all the obvious things. Are you earthing the turntable? That's an important thing. Is it being earthed correctly? Most of them have an earth lead. Yeah. So, if that's not connected, then that can cause problems. Although I've known earth leads not to be connected and turntables to be silent. It really depends on how the house is wired up.
Of course,
this gets into, because of course the danger with having a discussion like this is we get into areas where suddenly people think it's snake oil. But I would say that electric supply does vary in quality. That I know people will say, "Oh, how does that happen?" But it's quite demonstrable to me. I mean, I live in rural areas. I've mostly lived in rural areas in America. I lived in the middle of Ipswich, and we forever had problems with electricity noise out there, which wasn't really a noise specifically of a hum or anything. It was just that the quality of sound seemed to be better once the off-peak hours approached.
No, that's interesting.
And I would guess that's the same here, but where I am here in America, there's about 2,500 people live locally. I don't think we have an electric cooperative in this part of the world here in northern Minnesota, so right on the Canadian border. And basically, we just have an electric cooperative here that supplies to very few people. So I'm guessing that, we get I don't know, but I'm guessing we get a fairly pure electric supply. Okay. So little things like that can make difference. Cabling as well.
Cabling was going to be my next question because
I wanted to actually talk about that with hum because I had a specific problem. I had a specific hum problem with my phono stage, and I thought, and I tried for years to get rid of it, and I haven't completely eliminated it now, but it's now fairly quiet to the point it doesn't really matter. And I just found an Audio Quest, no brand loyalty, but just happened to work. I found a certain Audio Quest, fairly cheap evergreen Audio Quest cable that I connected from the phono amp to the amplifier itself, and it solved the noise almost completely. So it, as I say, real trial and error. But anyway, on to cables.
So that because. Obviously, we're saying to people, look at the heart of the system, maybe the amp, or it maybe think about how much money you're going to spend on your speakers or your turntable or CD. The thing that connects them all together are the cables, and you can go down a real rabbit hole with this. With what HiFi magazine will they'll recommend a cable that's like 10 times the cost of the one that you might find on Amazon. And then you have some people that saying it's the size of the cord, the size of the cable, etc. It needs to be a certain size to carry the certain size, the frequencies. Now, this is where I do think some people do say, snake oil, this is how much do you really need to spend? And you can spend ages on forums where people will say it's rubbish, you don't need that, you only need one of these. Where do you stand on that? What do you think is the right approach?
I've gone down this black hole many times in my listening career. First system I had was in '86, and at that time I had QED 79 strand cable, which people may remember. That was a bit of a de facto standard in fairly most systems, I think, in those days. It was QED 79 strand, just seemed to be very popular. And over the years, of course, the whole industry has built up in very exotic cables, and I've got some that I've kind of acquired down the years. But I would say that it's really, until everything else is right, the cables... Yes, you need a certain good quality cable. I mean, don't use bell wire, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, and people will say, and a lot of people will say, well, it doesn't measure any differently. There's no difference. But, I mean, most people who've been into this hobby for a while will tell you that there are differences in cables. In fact, there's differences in everything you do. It's a question of how much you're listening to it or how much you care about it as to the difference it makes. I generally find that cables are a fairly short-term effect because you compare them with what you've got, then you sort of after a while you forget that the cable's having any effect because you've gone to a new standard effectively.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But there isn't a great need to spend a fortune. I keep coming back to Benchmark as a company, but I've got a few of their components, and they recommend what's called Star Quad cable, which is a fairly standard pro audio cable that works really, really well for people. And unless you're going to be spending a fortune, that's probably as much as you'll need. Now, there'll be any number of comments in the video underneath to say I'm wrong on that. And I'm not saying there's any one way of doing this, of course. There are 1,000,001 ways of doing it. But if we're trying to get people, if the purpose of this talk is to try and get people up and running a bit more, I would say go for a Star Quad cable. They're fairly easy to find. You can find them on eBay or anything. There's, companies like Audio Quest do a whole range of cables going from, budget to, the price of a Rolls Royce probably. But, at the end of the day, you just make your own kind of choice as to what your budget is. As far as a percentage, I've heard all kinds of percentage figures for what you should spend on cable. I would say definitely leave some budget for cable, but make sure if you just go for Star Quad, and you can probably equip most systems for £100, or I don't know quite what the cost would be, but probably £150. You could probably, depending on the length of speaker cable you have, you could probably kit out with interconnects and speaker cable for that sort of money, and it'll give you absolutely great sound. That's what I mainly use. I did find a Nordost cable at a very special offer recently, which speaker cable, which solved a particular problem I had with my pair of Celestion Kingston speakers, which are basically you have to fit the connectors underneath, and through a tube in the stands. So that was a particular technical problem that was solved by these very thin connectors on this Nordost cable, and that's a little bit more exotic than I would normally go to. But I've got to be honest and say that I really can hear the difference. So yes, there are differences, but don't get too carried away with that. It's much more important to focus on the components.
I think also the other thing to mention, of course, is that we all live in different environments and different size rooms and houses and whatever. And so the system that you look for or whatever to get the best sound out of a music collection has got to fit in with the aesthetics about and where you are. And remember that, because somebody might read, it's these giant floor standards are just what I want and I've got the budget, but you end up with them being literally 2 feet away from each other because you haven't got the room to and you haven't got the amp to power them up. So I think this is why, again, it is like a hobby, because as you go through life and you move into different premises, you'll suddenly think, I could probably go for those floor standards now rather than the bookshelf speakers that I had before. So for anyone listening thinking, gosh, I've got to go straight for, the top end, you haven't, have you? It's whatever sounds best to you and makes you feel happy in the environment that you're in. Absolutely.
And, it's really a question of your own. It's rather like anything else. I mean, I suppose wine is a good analogy here where, I don't drink much wine. I like a sort of mid-price bottle if I ever have a wine.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I could go very, very esoteric, spending a lot more. But it's really a question of how I tackle that in my own mind. When it comes to audio, then it's a completely different mix, because I then get into a situation where I am more bothered about the high end. So what I'm trying to say is that everybody has their own kind of set of values, and that applies to how the sound they get. Some people will, and I've known this to happen, some people will buy one system and stick with it for 30, 40 years and be completely happy with it.
Because this is a great passion of yours, and you obviously know a lot about it. What was it, as you went through your 30 odd years of really getting into upgrading your system, that made you think, I've lived with that for a while. I now feel as if I want to move up to another level. In what order did you do it? Was it always the amplifier that was that kind of pushed to the next level, or was it the turntable or the CD player? What was the kind of tipping point where you thought, I think I need to move?
Question, actually. I think broadly it was I one of the things that's come back a bit in recent years as hi-fi shows. I went to the London Hi-Fi show, which used to be held out at what was the Penta Hotel at Heathrow for about 20 years when I was in England. I went every year. And Hi-Fi News and Record Review ran that show. And I would say all the top brands in the world in the earlier days of it would be there. Towards the end of that show, when really... Because what happened with hi-fi was that the AV scene kicked in, and it rather kicked 2-channel in the stomach a bit, and it never really recovered from that until probably quite recently, where it seems to have come back again. But what happened with shows was, of course, that's the curse, because you're then exposed to every possible combination of everything, and you suddenly go, oh wow, that sounds better than I thought than mine does, or that sounds better than I've ever heard, or whatever. And then that was partly it. I obviously, going into dealerships, would again introduce ideas into my head. But basically it was very much on a need to buy basis, in the sense that if I could hear that there was going to be a clear benefit somewhere. I mean, certainly in terms of CD, the CD technology moved on, the first 20 years of CD quite considerably. So, I think I had quite a few CD players, because what one was doing each time was making a really quite big jump in sound quality.
I agree.
So that was quite an interesting episode. Vinyl I came to afterwards, actually, because, I mean, when I was, first sort of married and young, vinyl was just, I'd sort of got out of the vinyl thing, and went into CD, but I did that in the early 80s, and I gradually went back to vinyl, as one does, and I kind of sort of upgraded to a point where I was sort of happy with where I am, and I've sort of stayed there. But really, it's I'd say I'm always on the lookout to improve. I'm not really. I put something on the little bios we do on your website. I said something like, I feel I've reached the end game, and audiophiles always say that kind of thing. By the way, I hate the term audiophiles, but I used it anyway. But basically, I think what happened there was that I very much had a situation where I sort of felt that I'd gone to a certain point, and I'm trying to struggle how to put this. I sort of suppose you always end up with thinking, yes, I'm where I need to be. And then lo and behold, something comes about that changes your mind. I went over to tubes for a few years when I moved here, primarily because I'd never used tubes, and primarily because tubes are a lot easier to find, and there's more tube amps out here, really, than there is in the UK. I've now gone away from that to the amp system I was talking about earlier. So really, I've regarded it as very much an education, but I actually also have the thing that I can vary things around. And how I do that, and I guess this gets back to your question of where to spend money, I actually have 3 main pairs of speakers that I rotate in my system. Wow. I have a pair of Celestian Kingstons, which were the top of the SL range that they did. They're made out of a material called alpha crystal. And what we'll probably do here, Phil, is I'll get some pictures together and we can impose them on the video so people can see them. Celestian Kingstons, I've got a pair of Teal CS 3.5s, which is a very nice floor stander. And I've got a pair of Quad 57s, which are electrostatics. Now, they're all very different, and they're all voiced very differently. But that was an ideal. But, in building to that over the years, I generally had to keep one and sell another. And that's really how I've gone along, selling bits and buying bits and generally upgrading. Whether I'm at the final point now or not, I can't really say.
I suppose it depends on how the physical music world alters and changes over time. Because we can go back over 40 years, I can safely say that, then no one had a CD player, or they were about to get one. Everybody had a turntable, probably a tuner then.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, don't get me started on tuners and how great they were.
A tuner usually covered in wood, and then of course a cassette player, which is now coming back into vogue, strangely enough, although there aren't any cassette players out there. And,
that's right.
And in my system, I bought a Cambridge network player, which I put through a DAC, so I can stream stuff, and then the DAC tweaks the sound, and it sounds really, really good. And it all fits in rather well. And most people's hi-fi stands have a certain amount of slots for your things. But what are your thoughts on the humble cassette, which I seem to be mentioning more and more in my reviews, even though I find it incredulous that they are returning.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It is amazing,
I think what it is, I think it's nostalgia. It's the tactile nature of the formats we used to have.
Yeah.
I think what's happened is, streaming is absolutely fantastic. I stream all the time. I have a Blue Sound Node 2i, which is not a hugely expensive streamer that I feed through my DAC and like yourself, and that is fantastic, and I use it day in, day out. But on the cassette, I think it's a nostalgia thing. We all had the Walkmans, and prior to that there were cassette decks in the home, or a lot of people had these kind of music centres back in the day, didn't they? And you shoved, maybe you had one or two cassette bays in there.
Double twin deck,
exactly. There's tremendous nostalgia, but when you actually listen to them, that's when the nostalgia tends to take a nosedive. You can buy very exotic players like Nakamichi, but they go for a price now you would not even believe. They go for thousands. They sell them over here used, and they go for thousands and thousands of dollars. They do sound very, very good, but that's because you can adjust the azimuth, because that was always a problem with tape heads, at the azimuth of the tape head to the tape path wasn't aligned very well, and you got this wow and flutter and all that stuff. Well, that Nakamichi really engineered all that stuff out of it to a great extent, and they're fantastic, but they're just not practical. And until they start making those at a budget level, cassette's a great format in the sense of how handy it is.
But it was what it was for. It was
of its time.
What it was for was to record things. It was to record your mixtape for your friends, wasn't it? It wasn't to buy necessarily a pre-recorded tape, which I always saw as like the poor cousin of the big black disc.
The reel-to-reel, which
the reel-to-reel, yeah.
That's one thing I've never owned. I've had friends that have owned them. I've never actually owned a reel-to-reel.
No.
I like them, but they certainly can sound great. But if you saw the cost of they're actually starting to sell commercial reel-to-reel, recordings now, and they're hundreds and hundreds of dollars.
Yeah.
So it's not a practical thing. But touching on the used market, that's where if somebody's looking to get going in this, eBay can be a bit of a danger, because how good is kit, but there are specialist dealers who sell online, who will be very reputable, you can deal with. Even most hi-fi dealers that still brick and mortar hi-fi dealers will be selling used gear all the time as people upgrade. Part exchange has always been a part of this. So there are that's a really good way of making a bigger leap. Most of my stuff, not most of my stuff, a good percentage of my stuff is not new, because there's, I particularly like vintage speakers. My Teals are from the 80s, my quads, although they were originally designed in the 50s, I've got a very good 1978 pair. My Celestion Kingstons were made in the mid-90s. I really like vintage speakers. So for me, the used market is the only option if I'm going down that road.
Because I think it'd be safe to say, because of people like yourself and all of us as music fans who feel like this, that we look after our stuff. So there is a kind of, when you buy anything secondhand, there's a good chance the person who's selling it has decided to upgrade, and what they're moving on is probably in very, very good condition.
Well, in fact, it's interesting, because I actually just sold my tube amp to go to these new benchmark amps I mentioned, and the experiences I've had, and this was another one, the experiences that I've had between buyers and sellers in this hobby. There's a site called audiogon.com, which is a great way of selling your gear over here in the States. I believe they might have an operation in the UK. I'm not absolutely sure. I know there's a UK Audio Mart that's a similar sort of thing. But what you find is that you get talking to, mainly people that you get to a certain level of equipment in this hobby, and people are very much like you, really, and you end up having the most great conversations. I had an architect, my previous tube amp that I've just sold was bought by an architect from New York State, and he's well into the hobby, and he and I just had some wonderful conversations, and and of course I looked after my stuff, and he recognised that. Equally, I bought new lately, but I mean, when I bought old stuff, I've never had a problem. I've never had anything that's been less than in great condition. That, Mark, it can happen. There are people out there who aren't so good as that. But I think you kind of develop a nose for who the seller is. Very much the descriptions and how the description of the item is tells you a lot. If you're into the hobby, you begin to get a few fairly big clues, and of course, pictures are exceptionally important. So you begin to build up a picture, and of course, feedback. That's got to be an important thing too. Okay. But I think I've never found it was a particular danger buying used. I don't think twice when I do that.
Okay, right. Well, just as we come to the end of the podcast, if you could think of, I hope this isn't an unfair question, but if you think of 5 things that people could do or should look at to improve the sound of their music collection, not necessarily in that order, but what would be 5 things that people could take away and think, that's a good idea, or I could look at that?
There's a good question. Okay, well, I think first of all, it's look after your stuff. Clean it, put it in anti-stat bags, put it in an outer sleeve if it's a record. Keep your CDs clean. I mean, that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is think about this is if think about what you're spending on physical media versus what you could spend on equipment, and decide if that's the right balance for you. I mean, people could probably say, well, I've already made that decision. But if people are thinking about moving up, then, I mean, in my case, I would buy a lot more physical media if I wasn't upgrading other kit. Money's not infinite. So essentially, those are decisions you've got to make. I think thirdly is ask a lot of questions of friends and people that you know. If you're in our Facebook group, then I'm always happy, and I usually jump on if somebody's asking a question. I mean, and I'm happy to answer questions in the comments or however we do it. But certainly, if try and ask questions of people, and if you've got friends with equipment, certainly use that resource. I would say definitely go to HiFi shows. If you have brick and mortar dealers, please use them. Those guys need your support, and I wouldn't say they're a dying breed. I'd say they've come back a bit, but even so, they do need your support. And fourthly, or fifthly even, what would be my 5th one? I'm trying to think of a good one to end with.
That's okay. They've been very good so far. That's 4.
Well, I guess it's think about also how it fits in your environment. I mean, don't buy stuff. You talked earlier about buying floor standers when you've got a small living room. Is that going to work? I mean, it might be the ultimate speaker, but is it going to work in your room? And really, on from that, make sure that all the kit you're buying will work with each other, and again, that's where you need to ask questions. But if you ask questions of online dealers, they generally have a support system within their company that will tell you that well, I've got these speakers with an 84 dB sensitivity. Can I run a 20 watt amp? Well, no, of course you can't. But that may be a question you need to ask of them in the early days, and really balancing that kit. And as a 6th one, I would say YouTube is a fantastic resource to learn things now, and online in general. So and hopefully you and I will do things where we could talk more specifically about different aspects of it. We've talked very generally today. It might be nice to sort of focus in on specific areas, but those are the recommendations I would like. But more than anything else, just make sure whatever you do, you enjoy that music to the max, because that's what it's about. It's not about hi-fi, it's about getting more music. And one thing I didn't mention was that the more the better the equipment, the more musical it is. And what I mean by that is it sounds like musical instruments.
Yes,
and that's something that you in the sense of where you've been going, you'll have appreciated more and more. And having musicians in the family, you are one yourself. You know what instruments sound like, so you're in a great place to be able to make that assessment. But I would just say enjoy the music above all else.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Chris. Thanks very much for being the guest on this podcast and
Pleasure.
sharing your expertise and information. And the next time we'll probably see you will be the Bebop Deluxe.
Yep, that's
Deluxe
a promise.
But thanks for watching and thanks for listening, everybody. And don't forget to check out the website, nowspinning.co.uk, and subscribe to the podcast and the YouTube channel. And I shall see you all soon. Thank you.